live.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick. Well, Rick is back in the house today. He's continuing to manage the transitions in his schedule. We're continuing to play with the live stream. And so as you can see, what we're doing here is we have the impromptu live screen up on the screen that's going out to the internet. And this is something that we tried 2 weeks ago. We have Chad the Alcoholic there front and center. I like how you're sitting right under that ceiling fan, Chad. That's just absolutely perfect. A nice halo effect. Oh, even better. So, so why do a live question and answer like this with a room that people can pop in and out of? Well, the reason is to get more interaction from you. Now, a lot of questions we have is, how can I get on the Discord server? Well, Rick put a good Discord link right up there at top. And so if, for example, as I'm going to continue to work through the short questions for PVK list that's on the server. We'll see how many of them we can get through. Maybe I'll be a little bit more disciplined today. But as I go through that, if I'm discussing your question, for example, pop into the room. If you want to participate in the conversation, pop into the room. The room, because of Discord limitations, has limited numbers of seats in terms of cameras, so you can probably scan through the questions and answers and anticipate where I'm going, what I'm going to talk about. So we'll see. Last week or 2 weeks ago, after the live Q&A, we had a little discussion on the server about process. Cassidy recommended maybe having a producer. We might play around with that. And we've tried that in the past, to have members of the server sort of get a chance to produce their own show with me, as it were, handle some of the questions. So we're continuing to play with these formats. And of course, the goal is to build a culture and a participatory culture that, you don't have to be a Patreon supporter at $100 a month or anything like that to participate. That's the goal. So that's what we're doing. So those of you who are in the room with your cameras on, thank you, because that's another value on the server. Well, even though we have Chad the Alcoholic with a mask, but he's a special case. Part of he doesn't always have his mask on the server, but there you go. But part of the reason that we like cameras on the server is because, again, we want to see each other as people. And Rick just put code up there. Rick, what do you get? You got a notepad? There we go. We want to see each other as people, because we believe that if, in fact, we see each other as people, we will treat each other as people and not as these anonymous avatars on the internet. So anybody in the room have anything they want to say? What, do you think that's not true, Chad?
No, I think it's true. I kind of feel guilty. Like, if we were in this room and the camera wasn't going, this would all be gone. But
right,
this character is purpose for anonymity for me, but thank God everybody doesn't have it.
Yeah. And I think that's fair to play with. When I did my conversation with Vocal Distance, I mean, he, in a sense, adopts sort of a persona. He does have his real face, obviously, in the conversation, but he does use a pseudonym. And it is also the case, and I haven't really dealt with this in any of my videos, that names are true with respect to realms. And for example, in the book of Revelation, God gives new names for that realm. Adam gives names in Genesis for a realm. So I don't think it's evil or wrong to use an avatar or a pseudonym for a particular realm. But what we're trying to cut down on is an internet culture of anonymity that tends to hamper and harm the value and the productivity of the conversation. So part of why we're trying to develop a culture like this. So anybody else in the room have something they want to say, or if you want to introduce yourself a little bit, that's fine too. So we know a name to a face and why you're here.
Yeah, sure, if I may. This is just so weird. My whole biology is programmed to just have Paul talk for 3 hours without having to chip in anywhere. So this is so weird.
Well, I hope it's a good weird.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Jacob, I forget. I think I'm Brotiff on this Discord. I found you through my pastor in Tucson, Andy Littleton.
Oh yeah.
You've done some conversations with him.
Yeah.
I'm actually in Spain right now. It's not the work hours for me right now.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm gonna jump into the questions, and Yan Shu asked a question. Yan Shu has been on the channel. He's working on another philosophy degree, and he and I have been talking about my work and his work, and it's been quite productive. So I expect a very difficult question from him. Paul, what do you think about the idea that there is no egregore principality collective intelligence? Rather, what goes on is that some agent observes other objects, persons interact and relate with each other as third-person data. I think that's, well, I don't know about no egregore principality, but I think that dynamic that you point to is definitely true. I was just thinking this morning as I was getting into the car to come here about the Jung statement that Peterson likes to talk about, which is ideas. People don't have ideas have people. And I think part of the reason we use the word idea, which is something I think that in the second sentence of your question you're pointing to, that's sort of a data. An idea is data. But what the other perspective points to is that sort of what Jung pointed to, that ideas also have a degree of agency. Now, again, it's this question, do they have consciousness? If so, what kind of consciousness? Do ideas have telos? Part of the difficulty in this conversation is the difficulty of consciousness, because when we use the word consciousness, we reference the experience that we have of bringing intentionality, telos, all of these aspects into a realm and managing it through there. So I think it's also part of our culture to be reductive. And so we'll want to say it's an egregore or it's an idea. No, I think we have ideas, and I think we have principalities and powers. So, and I think we're probably really bad at being able to know what's going on levels above ourselves, just like the corn is really bad at knowing the dog, and the dog is really bad at knowing the farmer. Now, the dog knows the farmer better than the corn knows the farmer, but there's probably knowledge that the corn has of the farmer that the dog doesn't have. And even though, unless you're a panpsychist, and even if you are, to what degree does corn have consciousness? Chris Bacow made a really nice little video of the dog and the corn and that level up conversation. So I think it's very true that there is third person data, and ideas I don't think it's hard for us to talk about ideas as being impersonal or merely data, but ideas are a very strange kind of data. And we've talked about them in strange ways. And this sort of brings me back to the conversation I had with John Vervaeke 2-3 years ago in sort of my redux of the ontological argument, crossing it with Pascal's spirit of there's a spirit of geometry and a spirit of finesse. I really have to have a conversation with Manuel, because Manuel had some really interesting ideas about emergence and emanation. And what I got from his idea is that when we look up at emanation, we see persons. And I think that actually maps onto the corn and the dog and the farmer. And that also maps onto the appropriate mode of dealing with, let's say, something that is coming from the direction of emanation is the spirit of finesse, and in other words, levels up, and the appropriate mode of dealing with things that are less personal than we are is the spirit of geometry. But I'm uncertain that an idea is merely data. Ideas seem so powerful that, data almost sounds like inert code, whereas, let's say, a computer virus is living code. It's an executable. It's an application. And so, for example, there's the data in a spreadsheet, and there's a macro. So a macro is executable code and data isn't, even though a macro may be made up of data in terms of the code that someone puts into it, but it's sort of given life in that arena. So I've only gotten through two. And I also want to say, from last week's podcast, one of the things I thought of, I know, who was it that asked that big question and they were a little upset? Oh, I think it's just the question before, Zito, who goes by a different name on the internet. And that's part of the reason the names are difficult. He talked about hierarchy, and I actually thought of making a video about that this week, because there's ontological hierarchies and there are value hierarchies. And if you listen to Peterson carefully, for example, he misspeaks like we all do. He's not perfect, but he does try to be careful in many respects. But you almost always hear him talk about a value hierarchy. And, thank you, Rick. Thank you, ABC. Questions on the YouTube. All right. So if someone might want to pull that question over to the Discord server, it makes it a little easier for me not to miss it. I was thinking about making a video about his question, because when in our common discourse, we talk about, when you hear something like men are better than women or women are better than men, it presupposes sort of a generic hierarchy. But I think what's actually implicit in statements like that is some hierarchy of being. And those questions about a hierarchy of being get into very old philosophy, but very durable philosophy, such as, I haven't picked up the book yet, but it's a very famous book. It was a textbook in many classes, The Great Chain of Being. And that gets into, is it Neoplatonic ideas of degrees of ontology. Whereas generally speaking, when Jordan Peterson, speaking as a psychologist, talks about hierarchy, he's talking about a value hierarchy in terms of behavior. And that sort of gets into the main division at the beginning of Maps of Meaning of conceiving of the world as a realm of objects. When you conceive of the world as a realm of objects, ideas of ontological hierarchy or hierarchies of being easily sneak in. And part of the shift that Peterson brings when he talks about value hierarchies in terms of our behavior, and I often use the example, if I come to work in the morning and I open my office door and there's a Bengal tiger in my office, suddenly that Bengal tiger jumps to the top of my status hierarchy. The King of England or the Queen of England could be sitting next to the Bengal tiger and I won't see the Bengal tiger. Who has better hierarchy, the Queen of England or a Bengal tiger? Well, if it's a value hierarchy, the Bengal tiger shoots to the top of the value hierarchy. Or let me change the story a little bit. I open my office door and there's the Queen of England pointing a loaded gun at me. Do I see the Queen of England or do I see a loaded gun? And that's very much a value hierarchy. It's not an ontological hierarchy, because one might say, in some respects, the ontology of the Queen of England is much higher than an inanimate gun. So there are many different kinds of hierarchies, and I do think they are inevitable. So that's what I wanted to say about last week's question. Getting back to Yan Shu's question. Then they take this third-person data and transform it into first-person data, given the appearance of an egregore, agency, and principality. Yeah, I think that is sort of the standard model that we have. And I don't think that's a bad model, because if we use, let's say, the code analogy, it's the computer that executes the macro or the application. But here's the problem. That can only happen within an arena. And if you power the computer off, there might be data on that hard drive. And so I think basically in the Cartesian system, you have this firewall between the divided earth. You sort of had heavenly substance and earthly substance. And I think in that way, Descartes was sort of a bridge between the discarded image of, a very active world, and then the Cartesian world that sort of caused this meaning crisis where you have a lot of deadness. So yeah, I think, Hanshu, you're basically articulating what has become the standard model, that, well, it's all us live people down below and we're just trading data, and ideas are data. I'm not sure ideas are that simple. Some ideas probably are that simple, but ideas seem more like executables than data. Let me finish the question. That is to say, there are no egregores out there, but rather it is participation. It is overactive agency projector. Yeah, that would definitely be the current materialist model. I'd love, so at the end of that conversation with myself and JP Marceau that I played in response to the egregore video from Rebel Wisdom, John Vervaeke was talking about levels up, and I'd love to hear him expand on that in terms of what he's thinking, because I think most of what we're talking about, I think the frame that is most common is exactly as you're presenting it, Hanshu. All right, this is a great thing. Rick, you can switch back to the room with the cameras. I don't know if anybody here in the room or wants to get into the room to talk about this. Have at it.
I have something to say quick about this. So what came to my mind was, idea is the current telos in the story of now. So I don't know what the hell that means, but that's what came to mind. So it's like, it's constantly updating and firing. It's like a flame, like with a flame, you need oxygen, and it's constantly burning that. But I don't know. That's the vision I had. What the hell do I know?
Well, here you don't like theoretical thought there, and you jumped right in first, Chad. So you're welcome. Welcome to fancy Vervaeke land. Go ahead. I don't know your name. You with the brown hair and the beard and.
Oh yeah, I'm Jacob.
Okay, Jacob.
Yeah, I think where you kind of started with talking about how the rebel wisdom is kind of bringing enchantment in through this back door of new lingo. I think with the egregore thing really just being kind of a rediscovery of what was called spirit in, previous ages. I think a lot of what is being called re-enchantment is really just an inability to recognize um, that it takes more than just translation of individual words to get back to the thought world of the past. For a while, you were talking about Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and kind of the joke of that book is the title is like the meaning of secular comes from the word for age. So like the title is Age of Ages, but what it's come to mean for us is something so different. And with this egregore idea, there's this hubris about re-engaging with what once was called spirit or gods because it feels childish. But it takes a lot more work than just doing a one-to-one of these words of what what we think of as gods, what we think of it as spirit in our culture, takes a lot more work. And I think you've been doing a lot of that work, spirit and Peugeot as well, doing a lot of that work with gods. Um, I think it's fallen off in in anthropology, a view to what is the soul, um, what is meant by the soul in regards to what the ancient understanding of that was compared to uh, trying to re-enchant um, is more than just mapping one to one these ideas back. Requires a lot more work.
Yep. Yep. I think that's right. In some of the videos recently on the storytelling thing, but when I was dealing more with this a couple of weeks ago, what happens in the West is the hollowing out of the middle, which is where egregores, principalities and powers, where all of this stuff is. And missiologists have been dealing with this for quite a while. And so then you just have this God far above and people down below. And I think that's also part of the meaning crisis, because once you take out the God, then the only enchanted agents you have left are us. And as cognitive science continues to penetrate us, then very quickly there's no more us left. And then you're sort of left with a Sam Harris type of determinism. And there's the meaning crisis right there. And people long for enchantment. Well, what are they longing for? They are longing for participation. And they're longing for meaning, and they want to be involved. So no, I think that's right. I think that's right. All right, Joseph. Oh, he's got two questions here. Joseph was Joe Schmo. I did a conversation with him. Was it late last week or so that I posted? It was a great conversation. It was really good. Hey, Paul, I really enjoyed your critical drinker videos last week. It is well known that George Lucas was a big admirer of Joseph Campbell and purposely structured Star Wars on the hero's journey. Similar adaptations of Campbell's work happen in many Hollywood studios. Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein seem to believe that this narrative is deeply built into our culture for millennia and even brains, but I would disagree to some extent. I think it's somewhat more recent, and I sense, as that you may as well, we both sense that that story is having some serious issues. Something that's been pointed out is that its structure is not universal, although it is widespread. But since literary analysis and mythologists like Campbell propose these structures, U-shape, hero's journey, etc., one could argue that our stories have gotten less interesting, less varied, and some of their richness and realism. In fact, many of these things Critical Drinker decries. Maybe one of the issues in entertainment is their adoption and conformity to these structures, making them universal. No, I think you're right, and Burn Power definitely would agree. He wrote a pretty salient comment on that one about the hero's journey. Today I posted the conversation I had with Dr. Jim, and Dr. Jim has, he's colonized me pretty hard on a number of occasions, to the degree that he's got his own playlist on my channel. He just dips in every 6 months or a year or so, listening to this little corner of the internet and watching everyone and having some pretty salient observations. He's turned me on to a lot of really interesting things. And I thought the conversation I posted this morning was, again, seminal in terms of understanding, I think really understanding the hero's journey, especially in a culture and context of self-actualization. And I think self-actualization is actually a reduction of what for religious people, especially Abrahamic people, would be the story of God. In some of those videos, I noted that part of the difference between our modern secular storytelling, especially as they circle around the hero, is that they are about self-actualization, and they are about the self-actualization of the hero. In the video, I noted that the hero functions as a hero because the hero either transforms the niche. I guess it's drawn sending me emails saying, say it correctly, niche. The hero transforming the niche, but as again I was delving into this with Dr. Jim, one of the things in the Bible is that the Lord, the God of Israel, is the hero of the story. And part of, again, if you pull back from a merely God number two framework and have a God that is fully God number one and God number two, as the Hebrew God is, having God be the hero is a arena that is inclusive of us, and it affords participation. And when, I think you're right, Joseph, when storytelling is reduced to a hero's journey, and that hero is one of us, participation and the possibility and potential of participation is reduced. I think we see that in celebrity culture. Whereas in this realm of creation in which we act, there are many heroes and there are many villains, and sometimes heroes and villains are the same people. And that doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as good and evil. Good and evil is something I want to get to in upcoming videos, because that very much comes into this, and ontology of evil that we've brushed against now and then, and which has a long discussion in Neoplatonism and Augustinian theology and Platonism, etc. But I think you're right. In some ways, the hero's journey is perhaps spent. It's reached its telos, and in that it's reached its limitations. And when we look at soft reboots, we're seeing, I think, what Dr. Jim, now I put a flurry of videos up on my Clips channel out of the Dr. Jim conversation. And I also made a Substack. If you don't have enough time to see my videos all the time and you want to sort of track from afar One of the best ways to do that is subscribe to my Substack. It's free. I don't have any paid levels right now. I don't know if I ever will, but it's free right now. And those are often video distillations, and it's sort of an accumulation of tweets. If you follow me on Twitter, Twitter should be a place for play. And so, as well as every now and then something serious, but there's the signal to noise ratio on Twitter, and probably on my regular YouTube channel, is too high for many of you that have families and businesses and lives of your own. Many who follow my channel closely have the kinds of day jobs or lifestyles that are hospitable to long form video. That's just a reality of a channel like mine. So if you have a day job and you can't follow this, there's always the audio podcast that has no commercials in it. There's always the Substack will, I'm put out maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 of those a month. So, and it'll come to your inbox. So it's a lot easier to sort of say, oh, what's Paul Vanderklay thinking about now? Boom. There you get some video summaries. And today I took some little clips from my conversation with Dr. Jim. And one of those clips is the question of, if the hero's journey is disconnected from a far bigger story that moves the arena towards redemption, which is the shape of the biblical story, at least specifically for Christians. And maybe, Joseph, you and I should have another conversation about the shape of Jewish storytelling versus the shape of Christian storytelling, because I think the New Testament, at least in the minds of Christians, clearly completes the Old, as Christians call it. So the hero's journey without the redemptive story of the arena bottoms out too quickly because of individualism. And a single life is too shallow a pool for our satisfaction. You could sort of riff on Augustine that way. And that's why we're not satisfied until we have God. And when we have God, we have everything plus more. Don't tell me panentheism, Luke. I know you're thinking it. So I think the hero's journey and our fascination with it is a function of individualism, but we're bottoming out. And then we wind up with something which is closer to James Bond, which is eternal recurrence, where James Bond goes through these little cycles of the hero's journey, but he never gets anywhere. There's always a new Bond girl. There's always a new villain. And in that sense, the story always gets boring. And that's how we're bottoming out on the hero's journey. That, we just continue to have the hero's journey. And I think in some ways, The Matrix was a great example of the hero's journey. And it ends, as Dr. Jim noted, with sort of a productive plateau where, well, maybe Neo and Trinity will marry. I mean, and that's where you have the duality of male female, and Dr. Jim talked about the Western and comparing the Western to James Bond. And so what we have now with the self-actualization hero's journey, projected by Hollywood, which is always chasing the money. Oh, we made big money with Star Wars. Oh, we made big money with The Matrix. Let's just keep pressing the button on the hero's journey. And then, the hero's journey is the definitive story. No, it isn't. The transformation of the agentic and the arenic, the new heavens and the new earth, is the far bigger story, because each of us can participate in that story in a way we can't participate in an individual heroic journey. And I think when you look at, let's say, stories in the Bible, I think you're right, Joseph. And especially, because there's the great narrative in Genesis and Samuel and Kings, these Judges, biblical narrative. There's no finer narrative in the world. But that narrative is far more complex. And I think what you have then in the Old Testament is the journey towards the promised land. But it's not just Israel. Israel makes the promised land by covenant. That's part of the tension that's in Judges and Samuel and Kings and in the Hebrew prophets. Because when Israel is in the promised land, but Israel isn't keeping covenant, the land will spew her out. And so it's a much bigger participatory story. And if there's a hero's journey in the Bible, it's the story of, is Israel the hero? No, Israel is the bride. Israel is the son. Israel is the bride. So God is the hero of the story in the Bible. And when God is the hero of the story, beneath the stories that are being told, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Lane Odell. Rick, you're giving Rick his exercise by running over super chats. When God is the hero in the story, say the Spirit of God underneath, we get to participate. And I think in that way, we can be flawed heroes, fallen heroes. Look at Jephthah. Jephthah, Samson. Judges has some of the best of them. Flawed, fallen heroes. Almost, becoming anti-heroes in some essences. So I think you're right that the hero's journey is a function of individualism. It's insufficient to actually fully satisfy us. So I don't know if the poor Rick has to run over to the room and switch back to the room with all the cameras. Any thoughts on that from those of you in the room?
Hey, Paul, can I give a half-hearted defense of the hero's journey?
Go for it.
I feel like that there is, I think, something kind of biologically built into us that the hero's journey is tapping into. It is pretty darn old. Basically, every culture, as soon as they figure out how to write something down, they're like, oh, wait a minute, we have this awesome hero's journey myth that we should write down. Right? Like, one of the oldest things we have is Gilgamesh, and it is hero's journey. The Anglo-Saxons learned to write. What are we going to do? Let's write down Beowulf. That's a pretty cool story, right? And example. And I think Jordan Peterson is right that it's something like this story that most optimally taps into the male admiration complex or something like that. And then the question is, okay, so why do we have a male admiration complex that is shaped that way, that seems to like this, call to adventure and then supernatural aid and challenges and tribulations and then the abyss and then transformation. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page up here, etc. And I do think that Jordan Peterson is right that these stories that we like to tell that have a shape is something that's impressed into us, and that's impressed into us from that which selects, as Jordan Peterson would say, which is God number one. And that, let's see here, I also slightly disagree with your take that God is the hero in the Old Testament. I think that hero's journey stories often have the supernatural realm that's somehow interacting with the human in the arena, whether it's temptress goddesses or, supernatural aid, or sort of the God that's kind of judging you and rewarding you the whole time and that sort of thing. And I think that maybe to half agree with Joseph's point, I think that we felt like we got too good of a grip on the hero's journey due to Campbell and Lucas and all of that sort of thing and the success of Star Wars. And that once we had the formula captured, we could just kind of pump it out and repeat, and that it would keep working the same way. But I think that the thing with archetypes is, even as we begin to recognize patterns in these things, there's still something that's beyond, right? The hero's journey that which selects is beyond full instantiation yet, except I would say that Christ is the full instantiation of the hero's journey. But even if Christ is the full instantiation of the hero's journey, that doesn't mean we fully see and appreciate his story for everything that it is yet. And so I do think that the hero's journey is a real thing. I do think that Joseph has kind of a point that we've tried to formalize it too much. But I still think that, I mean, in the Old Testament, like Joseph, that's definitely a hero's journey. Moses has lots of aspects of it. Samson, David, Daniel, right? They all have a lot of the patterns of the hero's journey, but Christ brings all of the patterns together and exemplifies them to the fullest archetypal extent. But we still need to learn how to see it for what it is. And I guess I'll wrap this up in like one or two more sentences. Like when Pajot was talking to that storyteller guy, the storyteller guy was like, well, wouldn't it be really frustrating and boring if there was only one story and we were struggling to just retell that story as best we could? And Pajot's like, no, that is the world that we live in. And it's even worse than what you're saying because the story's already been told and it actually happened. And our job is to help our eyes see that for all that it's worth. And so that's sort of my pushback on Joseph, I guess. I'll drop the mic there.
Good. That's good. Thanks, Sam. Jacob, you had something, and then CW?
Yeah, I think it's not, I guess I'm not fully disagreeing, but I think it's not insignificant that even in the Beowulf story, the frame is that this is the pre-Christian era. I think the hollowness of thinking of the Christ story in the Jungian way as like the ultimate archetype of individuation is problematized by the saints. The idea that as Paul had told his Timothy to be an imitator of him as he's an imitator of Christ. Obviously, he wasn't telling him to go to the cross and get crucified, but that within the individual story, with Christ being the first fruits of the new creation, I think that allows for this multiplicity of types of stories. You read about some of the saints, and it's like she was a virgin, and then someone tried to get married to her, and God saved her from getting married, and that's how she was a saint. And it's like it's so foreign to us as like being within this grand narrative. But I think that in this idea that Pajot keeps bringing back of like that the saints uphold the world, that in this multiplicity of types of stories, I think as you were actually saying as well, that like they all feed up into this Christ narrative without having to, in your own individual story, shoehorning this hero's journey into every aspect of your struggle, that Christ is at the top of that as the first fruits, but your individual story doesn't have to be a one-for-one attempt at that.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good too. CW, did you have something?
Yeah, Paul, I think, I kind of dropped in here late, but I think you're absolutely right about the inadequacy of the hero's journey from a Christian perspective. Christianity does not reduce to the hero's journey. Part of the reason for that, though, is because Christianity doesn't reduce to story or narrative as such. And actually, I was just having a really brief chat about this with everybody's favorite Hutterite / public intellectual, Julian, about how there's so much talk now in Christian apologetics, especially in this corner of the internet, about the emphasis on story and narrative as a way of reclaiming either enchantment or something fundamentally true and inviolably so about Christianity per se. But what's so interesting about that, and what's often missing in those conversations, is that most of those efforts in one way or another are stemming from this book, The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative by Hans Frey, and the post-critical, post-liberal Yale School of Theology that kind of emerged at that time in the 80s after, when he wrote that. So there is like a rigorous, and Julian was expressing that frustration about that in his comment on your conversation with Pajot. There's this rigorous academic movement within Christianity that has been developing for decades that provides the rigorous intellectual infrastructure behind that notion of narrative, but it is almost completely lost on those who are polemically pushing the rhetoric of narrative and story as a solution for the Christian malaise or the intellectual problematics facing Christianity, and how that bleeds over into the meaning crisis. And I guess if we were going to use this kind of popular connotative sense of story and narrative, I think why stop there? Because to push the metaphor further, it's not just the narrative that's important, it's also the world building. And in that sense, I think John Vervaeke is exactly right. Because if we're going to address the meaning crisis, not just science, but religious philosophy also is going to have to get back to brass tacks and confront ontology. That's the world building. And there is so much that Christianity offers to an exclusive and explicitly Christian, and therefore radically critical view of reality. But that's going almost completely unnoticed in these conversations.
Well, there it's been noticed. Did Jacob? There he is, Jacob. This is your question. So, what do you have to say? You're still muted.
But it's Joseph, not Jacob.
Joseph, I'm sorry, Joseph.
It's okay. Man, I forgot what time it was, and I jumped on, so I was catching up. But yeah, I don't know. Well, I'm less convinced, I guess, of the kind of. When Sam and I have discussed this before, I'm less convinced that this story is built in universally. I think it's really. I think there's something to be said of it as like a very long-term, stable social construct that's kind of been built into the culture. I'm not convinced it's necessarily psychologically built in some sort of Jungian, archetype sense. That's biologically inherent to people. And while I do think there are parts of the hero's story that certainly, there are sections that it's incorporated that are universal, of course, like, you have the young person starting out in life, all that stuff. It's, of course, going to be fairly universal. I think a lot of what the Bible does is actually try to undermine the hero's story. And I think it does this, right? Because if you look at the books of the Bible, don't look at the individuals, but look at how the books are actually structured. The books, especially things like Judges, like you pointed out, or even the Joseph story, or Genesis in general, the entire cycle of Genesis, it really is showing either that you kind of tap out, as you said, or saturate on the story. The stories kind of collapse. So in Judges, you have this kind of collapse of the hero's story. You have that with the Kings too. Right? The book is not just structured on there's no book of the Book of Solomon. It's not the first 11 chapters of Kings. It's the first entire, first Kings, or all of Kings, because the split between the two books is artificial anyway. And Kings is, the first king is Solomon in the Book of Kings. It doesn't work out very well. I mean, he's an interesting person to kind of start the book, but that's not how the narrative is laid out. And I think I'm not sure who the main character is. I'm going to say that. I think there are ways to read, I'm talking about only, Tanakh here, the Old Testament, right? I think that book as a whole, whenever, however it was canonized as such, I think there's good arguments that God could be the main character, or Israel as a whole is the main character. And I think you can kind of read it both ways, and I don't know there has to have one, right? If we don't force ourselves into the formalism of the hero's journey, we don't need to pick one hero. You could really have a story about two different, people, agents, whatever, God and Israel, and they're interacting, and this is the story of their relationship more than anything else. I think in a Christian reading, I think you are somewhat pushed a little more into reading God as the main character through the whole thing, because that's like a Christological reading of it. But I don't think reading Tanakh on its own terms, that's necessarily the case. And I think, as I said, a lot of this is to undermine the idea that there are human heroes, let's say, or any individual human hero. Even the nation, made somewhat undermined as a hero. It's not exactly clear at the end, right? The last couple of prophets at the end, maybe they can be taken as a hero, but. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Oh, this is why I want to do my Q&A on the Discord. I know we get through fewer questions. We're an hour in and we've done 2 questions, but I really don't mind. I think again, what I said last week, I'd forgotten about that, or 2 weeks ago. Probably the best way to manage this room is if you keep your camera off, but if you want to stay in, that's fine, as long as there's open spaces. And then if you want to talk, turn your camera on, and that way I know that you want to talk. So I'm gonna, Joseph, just because we took so much time on the first question, I'm gonna skip over the second question.
Skip it.
And I'm gonna go to Not the Real Dostoevsky, who asks, what are the benefits of the existence of many sects of Christianity, or perhaps any religion for that matter? Conversely, what would be some negative consequences of hypothetical unity of Christianity, erasure of the line separating the sects? That's a great question. So we did a Thief in the Night live stream yesterday afternoon, and we had Nathan in, who has recently joined the Orthodox Church, and he came in guns blazing. And do people have theological fights anymore? And of course, I'm in there with Father Eric and and Jan van Donk, and we're like, yeah, all the time. And someone in the comment section to that live stream basically said, "Typical Orthodox bro," which I thought was hilarious, because there are, at least in this little corner of the internet, it's downstream from Peugeot and maybe Jay Dyer, so many new converts to Orthodoxy that are filled with enthusiasm for their new faith. And I am not criticizing that or critiquing that. That's exactly as they should be. It's sort of like, as I said in the live stream, it's sort of like if the first phase of falling in love for many of us is infatuation. And that's how it should be. If you're actually going to get over the egoist hump, and now ego is very much built into infatuation, but if you're going to get over the hump and actually pledge lifelong fidelity to a partner, you're probably going to need to have the strong enthusiasm and power of infatuation to get you to that point. Now, it's always dangerous and risky, because what you get infatuated by might not be worthy of your attention. That happens to us often, and that's part of the reason many cultures have periods of courtship to at least give you a little get more information beyond the infatuation phase. So what does that have to do with the question of Christian sex? XSECTS, for those of you who are listening to the audio version and not reading it here. So I'm a Calvinist. What does that mean? It means I have a pessimistic posture towards human capacity. And I have an optimistic posture towards divine agency. That's one way to think about Calvinism. We're going to get a lot of things wrong. That's not always such a bad thing. If we can get things wrong in the right way, and if we can handle our differences in a productive way. There's Richard Foster. I think I have the book over here, and here it is. In my books at hand, Streams of Living Water. It's a wonderful book by Richard Foster. Richard Foster is really very interesting guy. There's a biography of Dallas Willard that came out a few years ago, and Richard Foster figures prominently in Dallas Willard's story. And what Richard Foster does in this book about Christianity is talk about different traditions in the faith. So there's imitatio, the divine paradigm, the contemplative tradition, the holiness tradition, the charismatic tradition, the social justice tradition, the evangelical tradition, incarnational tradition. And he sees all of these traditions as exemplifying aspects of the church that at any given time we often struggle, I can look at the camera too, we often struggle to embody fully. And so we see this in, for example, the Pauline articulation of the gifts of the Spirit. I cannot sufficiently embody all that is Christ. And in fact, so in the live stream last night, I thought Father Eric did a beautiful way of framing the new creation, because this creation is insufficient to this creation is insufficient to hold or to sustain the new creation. I think this is, I know Jacob, my friend Jacob the Jew, who it gives me his very frank critiques of Christianity. And well, the ascension undermines the resurrection, because if Jesus wanted to resurrect, and if that was going to mean something, then the ascension kind of blows it. And I understand his point, and that's why I love Jacob. Jacob tells me what he thinks. And being a boy from New Jersey, who there are plenty of Jews around growing up in New Jersey, I like people who tell me what they think. If they think I'm full of shit, or they think my religion is way off base, tell me. You're not going to kill me by letting me know your thoughts. In fact, I find that to be the fun of living. But if you think of it in the way that Father Eric talked about, and I think that was a great way to phrase it, and C.S. Lewis kind of gets at that in The Great Divorce. Part of the reason Jesus doesn't stay too long after the resurrection is this world is too small for him. And in some ways, the church is too small for him. And so, whereas, as we talked about in the live stream yesterday afternoon, Christ's prayer that his church be one, O-N-E, his church be one, is something that we ought to long for and strive for. Yet it's not one yet. And in many ways it has, boy, now I'm going to really get into trouble with this one. It has never been one. So Catholics, Orthodox, I'm saying it. Now, at the same time, I think, unlike the Protestants, the Orthodox and the Catholics, and especially the Catholics, have been particularly good at trying to express a degree of unity and diversity together. And, you know, when I was reading Reformations, that book about the Protestant Reformations, I'm amazed at the capacity of the Roman Catholic Church to try to keep it all together. It's an impressive thing. And I, you know, in some ways, Roman Catholic apologists have something pretty impressive to point to say, look at, in a sense, the world's largest, oldest institution. You got a lot of problems too. Protestants know that. That's what the protest is about. Hopefully increasingly a friendly protest. So and then there are sects that are outside, let's say, so Nathan came in and said, you know, I said to him, I said, hey, the Christian Reformed Church, the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox, we hold a lot of creedal material in common. And now, of course, we've got Sam. Poor Sam came into this community, gets to be the poster child. There he is. That's right. Gets to express some of this diversity. And you're like that little, I just watched The Matrix. You're like that little Neo in the screen making the little hand signals. So no, and you've got Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. And, you know I got into a little bit of hot water with some of you when I said, in some ways, Islam is a Christian heresy. So what will Christ do with this? Well, again, I'm a Calvinist. He is God and I am not. And his will be done. And his kingdom will come. And many of these things are too great for me. And so I will trust him. And so I will point to Richard Foster, Streams of Living Water, and I will point to all of the ways that Jonathan Pajot's orthodoxy and my friend Sam's Unitarianism and my friend Jacob's Judaism and my friend John Vervaeke's non-theism have blessed me. So I believe Christ is king, and his kingdom will come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So there's my answer to that. All right, Rick, bring in the room. Did Sam want to speak for the Unitarians, or maybe he expressed what he wanted to? So if you want to talk, turn your camera on. There he is. Is it a good answer, Sam? All right. Anyone else want to weigh in? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question. All right, on I go. Jason S. Almond Tree writes, have you watched the show on HBO called Righteous Gemstones? No, I haven't. So there's a whole bunch of TV that I'm trying to get. I stayed up too late last night. I'm a sucker for Cobra Kai. It's kind of an after-school special sometimes, but there's something really, I don't know. It's just something really I don't mean it as it's something really sort of sweet about that show, and cheering for Johnny and his Eagle Fang group. I'm a sucker for that sappy story, and yeah, there's lots you could critique in it, but it's not high art, but it's yeah. And so I should finish that the show with the priest on the island. I don't want to give any spoilers. I forget the name of it. But most of that TV watching my wife doesn't like, and most of the TV watching I do with my family. I don't watch TV alone much, just because there's so many other interesting things to do in the world besides watching TV. So no, I haven't seen it, but I really appreciate TV streaming and movie recommendations, because I do like those things, and especially if they intersect with my wife or children's taste, then I get a chance to watch them. All right. Sans, I don't know how to say your thing, but here we go. Hi, Pastor Paul. About the trauma of the breakup between Quebec and the Roman Catholic Church. Peugeot, oh, what a wonderful conversation I had with Jonathan Peugeot, wasn't it? That was, I'm so tremendously blessed. And, you know, I posted Dr. Jim's calling Jonathan Peugeot a communist, and perhaps underestimated the power of the literal internet, because people are losing their mind over Jonathan Peugeot is not a communist. As if this is something that needs to be said. But anyway, so yeah, I feel myself so richly blessed by my opportunities in the last 4 years. Peugeot mentioned some political factors, but the main factors that come up in conversation among regular people about why French Canadians consider church evil are usually the pedophile scandals, other terrible treatment of children in schools for men, and the constant harassment to remain pregnant at all times for women. Interesting. Do you feel that the celibacy of the Roman Catholic priest class participates in these problems of the Catholic Church? Now you're goading me as a Protestant, aren't you? As their representatives are not family men who would like to have a different understanding of those two aspects I mentioned. Oh, good. He's here. I see his, do you want to say something to this? You want to elaborate on this a little more? Go ahead and make him a little bigger there, Rick.
Not sure I have much to add to that. Just that I basically I have some stuff that I scratched off at the end there. So I want to read it too. I thought it was too long. I wanted to leave it. I didn't know if I should take it out altogether. So
this doesn't put, okay. I apologize if my question puts you in an awkward position, but I'd appreciate having at least something to chew on in my thinking about asceticism and, by extension, celibacy. To me, if asceticism is necessary self-removal from the world to seek God, which kind of excludes possibility of participation in community, then celibate priesthood seems like a prideful thing when one pretends to be able to be both higher and closer to God, but also directly involves in daily affairs of the community at the same time, which seems incompatible. I wish I hadn't struck that out, because it's a good part of the question. And that gets into, there's a ton that gets into. So one of the little clips from one of the Thief in the Night live streams that I posted separately was, you know, some of the conversation about marriage and Protestantism. And I mean, Protestants are in some ways the sex positive element of the church. And, you know, from a little bit of the reading that I've done on the secularization of Quebec, you know, not just the pedophile scandals, not just the women feeling shackled by one pregnancy after another because of the Roman Catholic prohibition on certain forms of contraception, but also just corruption in the church. That came through big in some of my readings, that people saw just a lot of corruption in the church, and how that church corruption was corrupting even provincial politics or civic politics. So there's a lot there. Now, this question is a huge one. And and I got into this a little bit in my conversation with Dr. Jim, because Christianity really does try to have it all. Because on one hand, as I think Dr. Jim really nicely articulated, there's something powerfully central in Christianity about the productive union of male and female. And that is attempted to be borne witness to in the prohibition against certain forms of contraception in Catholic theology. Then there's also something deeply powerful about renunciation of, dying to self and putting to death this epithumia. And so that tries to get expression. Now, I wish Nate Heil were in the room, because then he could talk more about someone like Ivan Illich, who was Roman Catholic, who basically said, well, the main problem is the institutionalization of all of this. And whereas I am not as anti-institutional as Ivan Illich, his point is valid, that when you institutionalize celibacy, you tend to get these kinds of problems. And when you institutionalize certain technological prohibitions, you tend to get these kinds of problems. Whereas if you take some of these ideals, such as renunciation, such as the symbolic and instantiated fertility of male-female sexual union, you in some ways distort them if you push them too far, and in that way sort of take them out of the volitional space and turn them into a legal space. So there's a ton there. And so I think your question is great, and it's worthy of far more than I can devote to it right now, but this is huge. So I don't know if you want to riff on it a little bit more, or as Jacob has something he wants to say to it too. Go ahead, Jacob.
I'm really glad that you are on this topic, and have found it as interesting as I have. I wrote a senior paper on the Quiet Revolution. A few years ago, I went to Quebec with a kind of like an evangelistic sort of thing with the Baptist Association of Quebec, and I saw firsthand in doing cold evangelism, which is kind of crazy to me that I did that a few years ago. But to hear the vitriol in people of my parents' generation of middle-aged people towards Christianity and religion in general, and then to talk to people my age and see this openness to spirituality, this like pendulum swing that's already happening back, is really fascinating. And even the origins of the Quiet Revolution in the figure of the premier of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis. If you look into him and the way that he aligned himself with the Catholic Church, it's really hard to not see parallels with Trump and his alignment with the evangelical church, and just like the deep pendulum swing that occurred right after his time in office. An absolute hollowing out of the Catholic Church in Quebec, due to just the incentive structures that were clearly built into this alignment between politics and religion. And it's fascinating sort of petri dish of what I think a lot of people are worried about with evangelicalism here in the States with Trump into another roaring 20s after all. I see it as kind of a foreshadowing event in evangelicalism in the U.S.
Wow.
I don't know if you have anything
That's really
to say
cool.
about that.
That's really profound. And I think you're very much onto something. That's really good. Thank you for that. Anybody else on this? Go for it.
I guess I really just wanted to take it away from politics, from Pajot's argument, and bring it back to what regular people really say about it. The types of stories that you hear from your grandparents around here, from older folks. It's really personal stuff with having the bishop coming at your place and giving reprimands if you're not pregnant, if you're a woman. And,
Wow.
yeah, and just today there was another settlement that was announced between the Fraternité de Saint-Viateur, who I think settled for something like $28 million for something like about 300 victims of pedophilia, and it's stuff like this that gets announced regularly, and so I just feel like it's been downplayed a lot by the clergy or let's say religious figures or commentators like yourself, Pastor Paul, and I think it's the real stuff that got into people's lives that turned things around a lot here in Quebec, and yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that celibacy aspect, which I'm thinking, I don't know if it's exclusive to the Catholic Church, because around here we're, like my generation especially, we're very ignorant of how things are outside of Catholicism, because it was basically the only church that has a significant presence, and so I don't know if there's if that kind of problem is common in across denominations, and if there's a similar resentment in other denominations. It doesn't seem like it, and so to bring it back to celibacy, I just wonder how much it participates in drawing into the church some aspects of sexuality that might be marginal and that might seek refuge, so to speak. So yeah, there's a connection there that I just wonder how it's become so rampant, and yeah, that problem within the church with the treatment of children. And so there's a disconnect there between the priests and how it is to be a father figure,
Yeah.
and actually caring for children without crossing boundaries, and actually understanding what women go through with pregnancy and motherhood and all that stuff. And so there's I wanted to get your opinion on those aspects specifically.
Yeah. Well, it's, again, in Protestant land, it's a lot different. And I think in the conversations that are going on in the frontiers where I am, which tend to be between conservative and progressive evangelicals, it's far different, where it's, in some ways, it's post-marriage, it's sexual liberty, it's not only it's sort of a suppression of marriage even. So it's a great question, but again, it's far more than I can deal with right here. But a few other people popped in. So Greg, I can barely see your names. So you at the noon position, at least on the screen. You popped in. Introduce yourself a little bit, and what do you have to say about this?
Hi, I'm Greg. I recently found your channel from your Jonathan Peugeot interview. I was also raised Catholic, left the church for like 10 years, and recently came back through YouTube on Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson, which I think is a common story. I just wanted to kind of weigh in on this. I've had the opportunity where I am in my diocese to talk with a lot of the younger priests, like my age, 26, 27, or like maybe just into their 30s. Just from those conversations, it is, I think, a much more prevalent decision now from those like those instances like of pedophilia. And I think that it, for like all the terribleness of it, it allows for a much clearer choice now, I think. And those who are going into it, I think, are much more acutely aware of the decision they're making now for that. And I don't know if that's a way that event, I don't want to say that event had to happen, but for those constraints of celibacy, I think there are benefits to pursuing that kind of asceticism. But to your point, I do think that it can open the doors for unwanted proclivities. But I think with that coming to light, it allows now for a much clearer decision and a much more like under scrutiny. What was the only thing I wanted to contribute.
Okay, thanks. I thought about it in terms of the institutional anarchist perspective, which I summoned Nate somehow from the world. I summoned him. I mentioned Nate Heil, and here he came. Well, you have anything to say, Nate? I know you're pretty reticent to talk, but
sure. So actually, here's the thing, though. I am a Christian anarchist politically, but like I am a displaced Catholic. Let's put it that way. Like in my heart of hearts, I'm still Catholic. I'm currently practicing as an Anglican in the ACNA. But like I still pray my rosary every morning. I mean, that's like my theology is still Catholic entirely. And here's what I think about as far as the celibacy issue. I think maybe first of all, I doubt that the problem with the child sex abuse is the way it was handled by the ecclesial hierarchy. Now here my anarchism starts to come in. The ecclesial hierarchy handled it very badly, and that's the real issue. In terms of like, I don't know that the celibacy caused the pedophilia. I don't know if I believe that. I think that the sexual revolution and our general like obsession with sex positivity in our culture is going to affect everyone, including clergy. And that might take some interesting forms because of the celibacy, but I don't think the celibacy is causal. That would be my perspective, is that the celibacy isn't cause. However, I do think that in terms of like parish clergy, I think maybe going away from a rule of celibacy for parish clergy and this like limiting it to like the actual like holy orders that, you know, other than the parish clergy, I think would probably be a sensible move to make for lots of reasons, which is kind of like where the Orthodox are. And the Catholic Church has made like every other attempted concession toward orthodoxy imaginable, but they're very aloof. They're hard to seduce. All of Rome's conciliatory moves make no difference to the Orthodox, but everybody loves them somehow anyway. So anyway, Sam's the one who told me that I was being summoned, and I was like, well, I haven't taken my break yet, but I don't have my laptop in my office. My son's using my laptop, so I had to use my phone. So, but that's my 2 cents.
Well, thanks for coming in, Nate. Anything else? Anything else on this? It's a great question. And go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Sanha Kun, so you live in Quebec? Do you live in Montreal or Quebec City, or where do you live in between? And
is it different in different places in Quebec?
Yeah, want to mic up?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was gonna say I'm on the south shore of Montreal, and yes, there's a big difference between regions. There's I guess you could to paint with a broad brush. You could say there's the same kind of divide that there is between the. I guess it's the usual rural and urban divide, basically. Maybe I can just throw one last thing in there about that question. If you want to consider the fact that I think that generation of priests that did a lot of damage. I heard it from a lot of older people here that many men entered priesthood when the conscription was ordered right before the war. So you have a lot of men that sort of fled war into priesthood. So you might question their motives there, and maybe I don't know about their character, but certainly their motives. Yeah, so that's one last thing I'll throw in there about that.
I think in Protestant circles.
Thanks a lot, Pastor.
Oh, I think part of the reason in Protestant circles it's different. There's always this suspicion that perhaps faithful, same-sex attracted Roman Catholics might be tempted to go to the priesthood because it's an avenue of inclusion in the community, whereas if they're faithful Roman Catholics, obviously same-sex marriage, at least traditionally, historically, has not been a valid option. I think with a lot of Protestants, most of the sexual misconduct and abuse tends to be the youth pastor and the maybe a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old and the pastor and the organist. I mean, in Protestant circles it tends to be sort of generic adultery and fornication rather than same sex. And I know that that's a whole nother discussion that gets involved with the same-sex pedophilia scandals that have been. But you're right in that you can even with what Nate said in terms of there's a problem of the response of the hierarchy to these incidences, and one might very well say that part of the lack of empathy in the structure of the hierarchy could be because these fathers are not biological fathers. Because if you're a biological father and someone has done something like this to your son or your daughter, hell hath no fury like a parent whose child has been abused by a stranger, generally speaking. And so perhaps people have not had the lived experience of parenthood, don't feel this in their gut, perhaps like someone who is there's lots of different layers to this, but the issues go out and connect in lots of different areas. So it's a great question. All right. I think we've done that justice. Thank you. And this is working well. I like the interaction and the potential for interaction that we have with this method. We're obviously not going to get through all the questions. I might have to maybe grab some of these questions on a Thief in the Night show or something and do that at some point because, to catch up. Jack H. Hello, Paul. My question is were universities set up to symbolize the womb of Jesus? If that is so, what transition happened when they shifted into assembling resembling the womb of Oedipus. Oh my goodness. I don't know, universities, to my knowledge, arose in the late Middle Ages, and perhaps in some ways as an offshoot of the monasteries, but I know very little of that history. I do know some. George Marsden has written about the transition over the last 100 years, the secularizing of the universities in America, because many of the universities, Harvard, Yale, began as Christian. In Protestantism, Protestants formed universities to train clergy, but I don't really know the history of the universities. I wouldn't be surprised if they grew out of monasticism, just given, especially before the printing press, the role that monasteries played in literary preservation and multiplication, scribes, etc. So, yeah, it's a fun question, but don't feel particularly able to answer it. Oh, we got another super chat. Grim Grizz sends 0. You're just making Rick run across the building? Not even for taco money? By the way, Grim Grizz has a Patreon. Y'all should know that. So, all right. Grim Grizz, did you see Mikhaila talking about Jordan's kid having a demon in his talk with Peugeot? If so, is there a commentary video coming? I remember something vaguely. I watched both the mobster conversation with Mikhaila and the Peugeot. Did I get all the way through the Peugeot conversation with Mikhaila? I did a little commenting on Mikhaila's recent interest and pursuit of Christianity. Mikhaila is about the age of my oldest son. So, and I'm a little concerned about a youngish person living their life vlogging, especially when it comes to things like this, especially being Jordan Peterson's daughter. So a lot can go wrong. There's this internet stuff. I mean, if you're making your money on the internet, like Grim Grizz is trying to do, but like Mikhaila really is doing, and like Jordan Peterson is doing, like Brett Weinstein's doing, and like how many other people are doing, that crowd has agency. And something as significant and foundational as a faith transition and conversion, yeah, it's a big deal. So I've been reticent to say a lot about that. Topher the Salty, can you describe Yosemite and other parks in that area? Oh, Yosemite is an amazing place. California is blessed with so many terrific national parks. Yosemite is in some ways the crown jewel, but there's of course the coastline, the California seacoast, which is beautiful, and many terrific free beaches there. Southern California has some wonderful parks. Sequoia National Park is tremendous. Joshua Tree is interesting. So, but Yosemite is great. Yosemite's great. If you get a chance to go to Yosemite, definitely take it. It's well worth your trip. If you can go at some time other than July and August, even better, because it is mobbed in July and August. I got a chance to go to Glacier National Park last summer, but it was so smoky I could hardly see anything. Bummer. So, Chad, you have something you want to say to the national parks question?
Yeah, if COVID is still going by then, I'm sorry, my beard is really itchy right now. If it's driving me bonkers. If COVID is still going, like my wife and I went to Yosemite over the summer, and COVID really helped us out. We didn't have any waits. There was no traffic. It was ridiculous. It was really, and to describe the beauty of it, you probably need a whole book full of really crazy poetry to do it, because it's just beyond words.
Yeah, there's glory in that space. It's amazing. So
Real.
Topher the Salty, good to see you in here. How do you delineate between different spirits in your thinking? For example, I think there is a spirit of progress that is highly influential in our culture today. Oh yeah. It is difficult to tell if this should be thought of as one spirit or many. Yeah. And I think again our limitations in knowing the spirits, my little analogy of corn and of farmer's corn and farmer's dog and farmer is really helpful in that, how much differentiation can the corn do about different kinds of dogs and what those dogs are doing? And we're really limited. So, and I think your example is a great one where, yeah, the myth of progress is myths are big, powerful spirits. And yeah, it's so, this is where Peugeot, I think, is really onto something when he says we probably couldn't be talking like this 20 years ago. Some were, of course, but as modernity recedes, our capacity to imagine and articulate this stuff will expand a bit. And but still there's so much we don't know, and we're probably not going to know. So great question. Hanshu, are we supposed to be obedient to God or submit to God? Obedience is an act of submission. I'd have to know the differentiation between those two words in your mind. Both have very different implications. Well, yeah, this is a big question. And I don't know if the question is, I don't know if you would have to expand for me more how you're using those two words for me to get a sense of what you're talking about. So, and unless you're in the room, I don't see you in the room. I think I'll pass over it. Paul, how do you view the spiritual effects of frequent marijuana use in comparison to alcohol? I'm sure there are other young 20-somethings who are coming back to the church while growing up smoking pot and still are. I've never smoked pot. I don't drink alcohol. I listen to people who have. One man in my congregation shared with me how much pot he smoked when he was a teenager. And he basically looks back at his life and says, when you smoke a lot of pot, you don't really do much. So that was his take on it. And I've heard that from other people. Alcohol is a little different. There's both a social aspect to pot and alcohol. So, I guess I don't really feel myself able to answer this. Well, Rick, why don't you open up the room? All you potheads and drunkards, why don't you come in? Hey, we got an alcoholic here. So why don't you come in and answer this question for me? Because I don't feel particularly well equipped to do so.
Okay. Hi, I'm Chad. I'm an alcoholic. So for me, it's a matter of person, really. I mean, for me, it's at the end of the day, it's all trying to do the same thing for somebody like me. Like it was kind of like I don't know, it was kind of like a God, right? Like, so for me, I didn't have a relationship with God. So for me, the spirit, it provided a connection, right? So the difference between alcohol and the spiritual difference, I don't know, man. It's the effect that alcohol had on me is it kind of set me free. It allowed me to become feel like a person and be able to connect with people. So yeah, if that's and pot did some of that for me too. But so did some other drugs. But yeah, I don't know. That's my take on it. It's pretty basic.
So if anybody else out there wants to jump in and give an answer to this question, there's the Discord link. Turn on your camera and looks like Jacob has an idea. Go for it.
I come from a state where weed was recently legalized, and it's been interesting to see the difference in the way that weed is perceived in the church, and I don't think it's been fully thought through, like what the policy will be like. But I remember in college, prior to legalization, it was a part of people's lives that became secret. Friends of mine who were Christian that made their drinking and their pot a hidden part of their lives, and way that any kind of deep secret drive a wedge between you and your community, because it was perceived as so dirty, specifically pot, by the church. I think regardless of materially what it is, when the church renders something as dirty or untouchable, it leads to those who struggle with that, or even, they're not ashamed of it in itself. They just don't want to talk about it at church. When there becomes this realm of secrecy, they don't want to be ostracized if they mention, partaking every once in a while. That's really where the wedge. I've known people who have completely left the church, and it started with the judgment that was heaped on them from their pot use. And I think to me, that's really the root of it. Like, nothing inherently wrong to me about pot or king in itself, but when it becomes a modality for having like a secret hidden life, that's where church really fails people.
Okay. Jesse, you've got your camera on. Did you have an answer for this?
Yeah. I didn't think the conversation would go this direction, but I guess I have thoughts. Paul, I talked to you. We did a randos talk a couple of years back now, but I smoke pot. Well, vape generally, and I guess I don't have fully fleshed out thoughts on this. It's a ever-going conversation in my head. I guess one thing I wanted to say was that it isn't clear to me necessarily, circling back to the question itself, that there is necessarily like a one-to-one connection of this inherent spiritual decline, if one is pursuing Christ, let's say, and also marijuana is a part of their life. I mean, it certainly can be the case, and I wouldn't say that I advocate for its use. I mean, I think it's probably a hard issue, and different situations vary. But for what it's worth, for one anecdotal perspective, and I'm not saying that they're connected per se, but I probably started marijuana maybe 2012 or something like that, and I wouldn't say, again, it's not connected, but my real walk with Christ, even though I grew up in the church, really only started 10 years ago or so, and has continued to deepen and become more real and alive. And also marijuana was parallel to that. And again, I'm not connecting the two, but I just want to note that growth in our walk with Christ and marijuana being present necessarily doesn't harm the other. Let's say, at least in my one anecdotal situation. So I just wanted to throw that out, I guess.
Okay.
For what it's worth.
Pastorally, alcohol has lost its medicinal value. You know, back during the Prohibition era, people would drink for medicinal purposes. Alcohol, I see used socially. People use it to people self-medicate with it to varying degrees. I have known pastorally people who have, at least in California, before it was legal recreationally, it was easily legal therapeutically. And I have had members of my church who have tried it out as ways of addressing anxiety, as ways of addressing chronic pain. There was a woman in my church that had MS that used it regularly. I've had some seniors in my church that have tried edibles for chronic pain and some other things. Again, in many of these cases, it has been sort of medical approach. Almost everyone, not all, almost everyone in my church that came to me and told me about their pot use approached it medically, and the one person left the church, so I don't know if she still uses it, but the other members that did talk to me about it tried it medically and abandoned it for their own reasons, mostly because they just found that it sapped so much of their, in Spanish you'd say animo, so much of their motivation, that when they did pot, they didn't want to do anything else, and they got tired of being so lethargic that they went on to more traditional, consulted with their doctors and about other ways to deal with their anxiety or their chronic pain. So it's a good question. All right. Hey, we are making progress. We still have 10 minutes. What are your thoughts on Ravi Zacharias, and what were your thoughts on Ravi Zacharias, and what are your thoughts now? I was never big into Ravi Zacharias, partly because I was never big into that sort of apologetics. I read a couple of his books, appreciated a lot of what I read in them. When I heard the revelations, like I said, with respect to the pedophile stuff in Protestant land, most clergy sexual misconduct is sort of going off the reservation in the usual way. And the fact that you would have a man getting up in years who is very high status, doing a tremendous amount of traveling, wander and fall in this sort of respect. Look at some of the stories that came out about Bill Hybels. Status brings its own temptations. Just because someone is articulate, smart, sharp, doesn't mean that everything in their life is in order. It's also a little difference in terms of Protestantism with respect to saints. Part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation is Luther wants to sort of put away a lot of the sainthood game. And I think, as with many things in the Protestant Reformations, there were good reasons for it, but there were also good reasons for the development of the things that Luther protested. And that's sort of where I stand with respect to sainthood. I think Protestants have saints too. They're just not canonized, partially because of the institutional chaos of Protestantism. And so Protestants sort of canonize people in the marketplace. And Ravi Zacharias was canonized in the marketplace. He was so he was slightly before the opportunities for YouTube fame, social media fame. He had more publishing fame and book tour fame. And I know there are people that would look at something like this and say, oh, his sexual misconduct discredited his work. I don't necessarily see it that way. If it's clear thinking, it's clear thinking, even if he, as a vessel for that clear thinking, was not what he should have been. And I feel that way with respect to all sorts of cancellations of ancient people for their own sins. Luther's anti-Semitism, John Howard Yoder's own sexual misconduct and strange theological ideas about human sexuality and marriage. If you want to look up a sad story, I mean, John Howard Yoder was one of the bright shining lights of mid-20th century Mennonite theology, and there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in terms of Me Too stuff. Like I say, with Protestants, it's much more common types of sexual misconduct. So I think saints, in the Catholic sense of the word, are exemplary, but yet many of our heroes have clay feet. So the story of Ravi Zacharias's life and testimony would have certainly been far better if he had managed to be faithful to his wife. But people have weaknesses, and temptations are common to us all, and people fall. Some of our sins are sins of our age. Say Luther's anti-Semitism was extremely common back then. That doesn't dismiss it, but I think contextualizes it. So there's, how about Augustine's, Augustine, of course, had a concubine and a son with his concubine. Now he canceled his marriage. He put away his concubine and, severed the relationship with his son. Was that a good thing? Would it have been better for Augustine to marry? I mean, these questions are so hard. And this is why God is judge. Because God alone can judge with the kind of judgment that none of us from within the stream of history and with the limited knowledge that we have of each other are capable of. So that's why God is judge. And we do judge people. We have to discern. But you wanted a few thoughts. There they are. Pray for my feet and back. Was Gomer a trophy wife? Didn't sound like it. She had her attractiveness, but in some ways she was a trophy wife because she was used as an example of something that is stand-in. And that's the book of Hosea. Amazing book. Could you talk about the spirits that specialize in derailing Christians? Oh my. The ones you can be gripped by while still considering yourself a Christian. Oh my. There are many. Pride, fear that leads to control, trying to control others, tyranny. There's a certain dynamic that happens, and so the Quebec pedophile priest question accentuates this. There's a certain dynamic that happens when you have to institutionalize something. And that leads to some of the secrets that Jacob was talking about with respect to, let's say, alcohol or pot. And, even by capital S spirits, I would keep it as lowercase s, but I understand why you capitalized it for the question. There are certain ways, there are certain evils that specialize. There are certain evils that feed off of Christian discipleship as such. And I think they're common to religious persons in a secular age. A lot of them have to do with self-righteousness. So when people deconstruct, if we use that term, or people apostatize, or people leave the faith, however you want to frame it, many of them express a degree of liberation. And for some of them, leaving the faith frees them from certain sins of hypocrisy, certain sins of self-righteousness, because those kinds of things tend to cluster around religious ambition and strivings. And so I would say those are some of the spirits that derail Christians. Now, deciding you're no longer going to be a hypocrite might mean the grip of other spirits and sins in your life increases. There's so many ironies with this stuff. Life is so complex. Let's say perhaps you went to a Baptist church where alcohol was forbidden. And, well, you drink socially every now and then. You drink a little bit. And maybe you just do a little pot every now and then if you were hanging out with some friends that did pot. Now, suddenly, you're no longer going to church, so you're drinking all the time, and you're doing pot all the time. And so, whereas when you were a Christian, you had certain spirits of hypocrisy and duplicity, and those were twisting your soul in one way. Well, then you leave the faith and you leave the church, and those spirits no longer twist your soul. You just be open with everybody about what you think and what you do. But now other spirits are starting to feed on you in bigger ways. So which groups of spirits do you want eating at your soul? And I think the best way to be is to give yourself to God's Holy Spirit. Now, think about, again, Paul of Tarsus and 2 Corinthians 12 and the thorn in the flesh. It's a messenger from Satan, Paul says. Boy, that sure sounds like a spirit. And he asks the Lord, take this. Why would God let a messenger from Satan continue to gnaw at him? Maybe it was because the surpassing nature of the revelations that had been given to him would lead him to pride. And God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm going to let that spirit gnaw at you. So there are spirits that specialize in derailing Christians, and they're usually subspecies of other things that are common to us, but the particular circumstance of Christian devotion, especially even serious Christian devotion, accentuates them. So the ones you can be gripped with by still being considered yourself a Christian. Wow, what a great question. What a great question. Thank you, Laura Liz. What a great question. And I think that's where we're going to call it today. I'll have to figure out how to mark this. That's a good one to mark it with. So maybe next week or whenever I pick these up. We're making progress. We're making progress. So anyway, thank you all for joining me today. And I see Saint Manuel is in the room. Yeah, I should talk to you sometime about your idea. That might be I was kind of hoping when I did the Thief in the Night yesterday that you might be around, because I'd like to hear more about your ideas of personhood and emergence and emanation. And so he unmuted. You want to turn, if you turn on your camera, Rick, you'll be seen in the room. I don't know if you want to say something, Manuel, about that.
Well, so here we go. Yeah, I kind of want to facilitate you in your quest to get these things together. So I'm not having a particular agenda apart from trying to fill you in a bit and guide you. So the idea that I wanted to talk about is not like I do want to share my journey.
Okay.
And the ideas I'm having.
So maybe we should just do another more in-depth one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
Do that one of these days. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that for now then. So, okay. So thank you all for joining me. Now, because of Rick's schedule change this week and last week, we did it at 11. I think we'll probably keep doing it at 11 instead of 10 to accommodate Rick's schedule, because it's sure helpful, and I think when we end the transmission on the internet, we'll probably stay in this room a little bit and or maybe we'll have to go to a different room. I don't know. Anyway, let us know your feedback on this way of doing Q&A. And again, as after the conversation we had 2 weeks ago, where Cassidy had the idea of, let's say, having a producer each week. That producer, I guess, could, maybe coordinate with Rick. Rick was kind of producing it today. Rick set up all the fancy technology. I wasn't quite sure how it would go today, but it seemed to go pretty well. So yeah, let us know. Give us feedback. You can just do that also in the comment section on this live stream. And yeah, so go ahead, Rick. You can end transmission.